Hello, everyone, and welcome to the FLA's webinar on fair compensation wage benchmarks. We're happy that you all could join us this morning or this evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. My name is Renee Bowers. I'm the Director of Accountability here at the FLA, and I'm joined by Jose Perales, our Data and Technology Analyst. We are today going to give you an overview of some of the work that we've been doing with our wage data collection tool, and I know many of you have already been deeply involved in using the tool. Specifically today, we want to focus in on how you can view the wage benchmarks that are part of our tool, and how you can use those wage benchmarks in the data that you collect as a means of really understanding compensation within your supply chain and using that as a foundation for your own decision-making strategy. As you all know, at the FLA, we and all of our affiliates have jointly made a very strong and deep commitment to fair compensation. And I know that you all have been working very hard to implement that commitment. Our goal, of course, is to make sure that we give you and all of our affiliates all of the tools and guidance that you need to help understand fair compensation, to help understand what wages are being paid within your supply chain, and understand where to go with that information. You all know that stage one of our fair compensation work plan was called Taking Stock. And part of that is really understanding, as I said, what wages look like in factories within our supply chains. We started out with a fairly complicated tool. In fact, we still use that tool with all of our SCI assessments. And that tool involves a methodology that includes taking a random sample of workers within any given facility in order to get a very good, rigorous, in-depth idea of what wages look like at that particular facility. And while we still, as I said, use that tool in our SCI assessments, over time it became very clear that that tool was quite complicated, and factories required a lot of support in order to be able to complete the tool. And therefore, it was difficult for all of us to really scale use of that tool beyond SCI assessments. And so upon recognizing this, we worked very hard alongside the Practitioners Working Group to develop a new methodology that can stand alone, and that is part of a tool that can be used with factories without lots of outside intervention or without lots of complicated instructions involved. We developed this tool in 2017. We piloted and released it in March of 2018, earlier this year. And we did this in response to lots of really good and helpful feedback from all of our affiliates. When we conducted a survey of all of our business affiliates earlier this year, and we asked you all to rank our fair compensation activities in order of importance, there were two very clear results. What you told us was that you needed a new wage data collection tool that would simplify the data collection process, and that you need a platform and dashboard to upload that wage data and have it stored in a centralized location so that you can easily compare between factories. Number one is what we'll be looking at today, and number two is what we'll be continuing to work on next year, and I'll address that a little bit towards the end of our webinar today. I do want to emphasize one really important point before we move forward, which I think we all know, but it's worth a reminder, that data collection, visualization, and analysis are definitely not the only challenges and the only things we need to address when we're talking about fair compensation strategy. This data is only a first step, and a very important first step. And I've been really gratified to hear from many of you that the tool and the dashboard are easier to use and that you're getting really good information. Many of you have mentioned that you're already zeroing in on regions of the world where you plan to target your fair compensation efforts as a result of using this tool. And that's exactly the type of information and activity that we want to hear. Our goal, including our goal today, is to help you understand the tools and use the tools and data not just for their own sake, but really as pieces of information that can help you move down the path towards articulating a strategy and defending it internally. All right, our goals today are really threefold. We want to help you understand the differences between various wage benchmarks on our wage ladders within the tool. We want to discuss methods for comparing data both between factories and then between regions, and there are slightly different methods for both of those two goals. And then, as I said, we want to really make sure that we're exploring the use of wage ladders as one first step to developing a fair compensation strategy. Before I pass it on to Jose, I just want to quickly review the commitment that we've all made. As you all know, the FLA Workplace Code of Conduct says that every worker has a right to compensation for a regular work week that is sufficient to meet the worker's basic needs and provide some discretionary income. And just as a reminder, the FLA's definition of basic needs is the minimum necessary for a worker and two dependents to access basic needs like food, drinking water, clothing, shelter, energy, transportation, etc. This definition is important to keep in mind, and we will address it a bit later on vis-a-vis some of the other benchmarks that you'll see within our tool. All right, I'm now going to pass it on to Jose to talk a bit more about the benchmarks and the wage ladders.
Thank you, Renee. So, as all of you have continued to collect data throughout your supply chain and have used the toolkit, you've used the dashboard and have had some questions about what you're looking at. We've collected benchmarks for around 11 countries, each with around 6 benchmarks. So in total, that's 66 benchmarks for which we have different types and categories. The important point is not to get overwhelmed by the amount of benchmarks, but to understand them at a high level. And the best metaphor really is to think of wage benchmarks as guideposts. There are around 5 general categories for benchmarks, and these guideposts are there to help you better understand where your factory is in fair compensation, how far they progressed or how far they have to progress. Those categories, as we see them, are living wages, wage demands, industry averages, minimum wages, and poverty lines. And we'll go into detail about how each of them are important and how they help you better understand your factory's compensation. The first is the category of living wages. These are more often than not published by some form of research organization. Some of the more well-known ones are the Global Living Wage Coalition, the Age of Floor Wage, and the Wage Indicator Foundation. There are also some academics who through their universities publish living wages, and these are often based on research on market basket of goods, some sort of assumptions on consumption and family size. And except for notably the Asia floor wage, these benchmarks are specific to either a country or a specific region in a country. So they can vary by whether that region is in an urban area or a rural area, and it's always important to note your factory's urbanness or ruralness when comparing a living wage. Now, Renee has some comments on how we determine family size and convert different benchmarks to the FLA's definition of family size.
Yeah, thanks, Jose. I just want to mention a few best practices and note that family size is one of the factors that really can affect any given wage benchmark. And over time within the industry, there are best practices that have emerged, specifically family size and the number of workers or earners per family should, whenever possible, be based on very in-depth and regionally specific research. The Global Living Wage Coalition, most notably, has developed a methodology, actually developed by Martha and Richard Anker, that addresses this need for regionally specific research in factors such as family size. And whenever possible, wherever those numbers are available, we make sure that we include the Global Living Wage Coalition numbers in our wage ladders. Similarly, housing costs can have a very profound effect on the final numbers within any wage benchmark. And as best practice, we want to note that housing should be based on international standards of decent housing, not just whatever housing happens to be available to workers. And that's because, as we all know, in certain parts of the world, the housing that's typically available to workers is housing that is very substandard. And often the housing surrounding a factory is substandard because that's all that workers can afford. So this is a pretty important distinction that we just wanted to call out. And again, the Global Living Wage Coalition numbers take that into account. I also want to note that because of this regionally specific research that goes into benchmarks such as the GLWC, those GLWC benchmarks are not yet available in many parts of the world. And again, that's why we often provide multiple benchmarks for any given region. It's based on what is available at the time. And moving forward, we'll work to update numbers and find ways to give you the most recent information that we have.
Thanks, Renee. Now, after living wages, next in our category of guideposts are wage demands. Wage demands can take the form of worker or union demands, and they're often made during either a worker protest or a union negotiation. The way that the FLA collects this data is through research on news articles or research published through a consortium of unions, and that's really how we get this information to you. It's important to note that this might differ from what a living wage determines as a standard of living or what an industrial average wage is. And that's because this is coming directly from the worker or the unions representing those workers. Now, industry averages, however, are often published by finance, labor, or economic ministries of government. These tend to represent macro industrial averages and might not be specific to either the garment or footwear industry, but could be just the prevailing manufacturing average wage. However, sometimes we do have access to data either delineated by rural or urban location or migrant or citizen worker location, or even data delineated by specific sub-industry type, such as garment or footwear. These can also include a subset that is specific to the disposable income for workers. Now, that's a little bit different than an industrial average, as the average for an industry is based off of the actual pay that the worker receives, whereas a disposable income metric is based off of the amount of the worker's pay that they spend on disposable, specifically categories of consumption that fit into disposable income. So that's a very tricky nuance to the subject, but really they're part of the same category of benchmarks. We also collect a vast amount of data on minimum wages. This can vary based on country to country. As you know, every country's labor jurisdiction determines minimum wages differently, and often that means that we collect information based on worker skill level. We'll collect minimum wages that are different based on the region in the country, and even in some cases the specific job of the worker or the industry that the worker is in. So it's important when measuring your factory's wage to this benchmark that you take into account the industry that the factory is in, the region of the country, and even the general skill level of the workers in your factory. We offer specific regional minimum wages for the U.S., China, Vietnam, India, and Indonesia, where those differences are pretty significant because of how large those countries tend to be, and because of the actual amount of factories in the FLA supply chain which are located in those countries. Now, last but not least, we have poverty lines. Those tend to come in two different forms, either specific national poverty lines published by governments of specific countries, or the World Bank poverty line, which is a daily purchasing power parity of $3.10. In both cases, we adjust those poverty lines to reflect a monthly two-adult equivalent unit family size in that country's local currency. This is it tends to be the lowest bar of the wage ladder. So when you're looking at your factory's performance and you're trying to examine how far the factory has already progressed, it tends to be that the poverty line will be significantly below, or in cases of a fair competition challenge, will be somewhat close to the poverty line. So that's really an important rule of thumb to judge your factory's compensation by. Now, Renee has another comment based on the actual definition of net wage. Just to preface that, the FLA's definition of net wage is the regular pay a worker makes, all benefits, cash or in kind, minus taxes and legal deductions. And we use that generally to compare against all benchmarks.
Yeah, thanks, Jose. I just wanted to add in a note around incentive pay and overtime pay. And you'll see, as you can see on the wage ladder up on your screen, we do not include overtime pay in a typical wage ladder. And that's because, as we saw earlier in our definition of fair compensation must be earned by a worker within a regular work week. You'll also note that we don't include incentive pay, although incentive pay may be something that you want to really look at on a case-by-case basis. And that's because incentive pay should only be included in net wage when it can be earned by every worker within a regular work week, meaning without overtime. So there might be instances within a particular factory or facility where incentive pay really is accessible to every worker within a regular work week, and in those cases, you can include that in your analysis. Jose later on will show you where you can find that information in our current tool, and moving forward, as we further develop that tool, we're going to make sure that you can access incentive pay information even more easily.
Thanks, Renee. Now, before we go into using benchmarks for deeper analysis of your factory's wages, we think it's important to take this time and level set the audience and go through the wage ladders of an example tool with the Toolkit's dashboard. Hopefully this demo will put us all on the same level of experience using the dashboard, and will better help our affiliates who've yet to actually start using the toolkit. So now that I've shared my entire screen, you should be able to see the tool itself. This is the instructions page. Now, if you go through the tabs and of your completed tool, and you go to the very end after the summary tab, you'll see a tab highlighted in yellow called Affiliate Brand Use. Here's where you'll copy all of the data in one single cell here, and then you'll go to the dashboards Excel spreadsheet, and then the second tab here, also highlighted in yellow, called Paste Data, is where you'll paste all of your data from that particular tool. To do that, it's important to note that you need to paste special values, which you can do by right-clicking and going to the Values button here. Upon successfully pasting the data, it'll turn green. That's how you know you've done the job correctly. At this point, you can go through your dashboard, see factory information, a breakdown of wages. Here you can see that most workers earn their pay through regular pay, but they also earn a few benefits in cash and in kind, and they pay a decent amount in taxes. Now, in this data set, which we've produced just for the purposes of demoing the tool, you can see a United States factory, and you could filter its benchmarks based on region. In this particular case, there are quite a few benchmarks which change based on the region, but you'll notice that on average the factory is well above any benchmark, but each occupation differs in how much they're above, or even in this case for the quality assurance occupation, below the living wage benchmark. So that's really how you take a cursory look at your data through the wage ladder. The dashboard also includes benchmark information so that you can better understand how we calculated each of these benchmarks and the methodologies behind each of them. Some cursory look at the worker demographics based on gender. And then, as Renee alluded to earlier, you can look at your overtime, incentive, and leave pay in addition to the net pay earned by the workers in your facility. And just like the wage ladder and wage breakdown, you can see the factory average and then all of the occupational averages. So now that we're all familiar with how to use the dashboard, let's return to the topic at hand, the discussion of using the toolkit for more in-depth analysis. So in general, there are two ways that you can use the wage ladder to analyze your data. You can either look at your factory's wages from a top-down or a bottom-up analysis. So an example of top-down benchmarking is where, in this case, you have 3 different factories, and they're all in the same country, so the same benchmarks apply to all of these factories. And within this country, you want to examine how your 3 factories are in comparison to a single benchmark. And that benchmark will be the GLWC living wage estimate in this example, which I believe to be in Bangladesh. Now, to do a top-down benchmark, really you're just analyzing the gap between this living wage estimate and all the way down to the actual factory average. Now, you can actually examine the difference numerically, but just visually you can see that the factory here has the lowest gap and the factory here has the highest gap. This is very straightforward and should be pretty obvious to people in our audience who've used the toolkit. The other way to approach this is to think about it with a different benchmark, a much lower benchmark, the national poverty line. This is what we call a bottom-up benchmark approach. So instead of looking at the gap between your factory's wages and a benchmark, you're actually looking at the progress from a lower benchmark to your factory's wages. In this case, you'll see the same result where the factory all the way on the right has the highest amount of progress and the factory on the left has the lowest amount of progress. Now, admittedly, that's very straightforward. You know, using benchmarks to compare facilities in the same country is a relatively easy process. And the question then becomes, how do you compare facilities across different countries? Now, it's important that before we apply top-down or bottom-up benchmarking to an example, you have to come to realize that not all benchmarks are credited equally, and that some benchmarks have what we call cross-country meaning. So, for example, you can use the World Bank poverty line as a cross-country significant benchmark because it's based off of the same purchasing power parity dollar per day across all countries. You can use the legal minimum wages between any country as cross-country because it's an arbitrary benchmark, but because it's a legal obligation, that legal obligation is significant equally across all countries. And lastly, because the Asia floor wage is designed to be the same across the entire region of Asia, you can actually use that for all facilities that are applicable to that region. So just to make this a bit more concrete, we're going to perform a analysis using one of these benchmarks for a set of factories in different countries. So here we have three factories in three different countries. The first on the left is from an Indonesia facility. In the middle we have a factory in a China facility, and on the right we have a factory in a Vietnam facility. Now we're going to see that visually, from the poverty line here to the factory here, using a bottom-up analysis, there's a pretty large performance gap between the World Bank poverty line and the factory in Indonesia's performance. Whereas China, that gap seems relatively small. And in Vietnam, it seems relatively large. Now, it's confusing because visually speaking, we're not comparing apples to apples. The exchange rate between each country is going to make the magnitude of that difference between the World Bank poverty line and the factory's wage look different depending on what country we're dealing in. And that's really the crux of the issue. So to get around that, what you have to do is you have to take the ratio between the factory's net wage here and the World Bank poverty line in red. That ratio is going to allow you to compare the performance of each country across different countries. So just look at this in numeric sense. You can see that in Indonesia, where the factory average wage is around 2 million in local currency, the Chinese factory's average wage is 2,000, and the Vietnamese factory average wage is around 5 million in local currency. And then you can see the corresponding World Bank poverty line. By taking the ratio of this row here and the factory average wage, you get a number for Indonesia, which is 2.3, China, which is 2.5, and Vietnam, which is 2.7. Now that means that Vietnam has the most progress from the factory's average wage and the World Bank poverty line. And China has the second most at 2.5, and Indonesia has the third most at 2.3. So that means while visually speaking, it looks that Indonesia has the most progress, has more progress than China, it's actually the case that because of exchange rates across different countries, the Chinese factory here is further along on fair compensation than the Indonesian factory. So if you're looking at your supply chain based on risk and you're trying to figure out which facilities are furthest along or have the most to go for fair compensation, this is really the best way to analyze that across countries, because now you can understand that Indonesia has the lowest performance for this facility. Now, here we'll hand it off to Renee so that she can discuss some, higher level questions on wage ladders and country trends.
Yeah, thanks, Jose. So we often get the question or comment from many of you that we have a lot of benchmarks, and we just want to acknowledge that. And hopefully you can understand from what Jose has shared that we're including so many benchmarks not to confuse anyone, but really because different benchmarks are appropriate for different situations. And depending on the type of comparison that you'd like to do, whether it's within a particular region or across regions, you might need different benchmarks that are more meaningful for that situation. And also, on the other hand, as we've talked about with best practices, some benchmarks are more important for understanding a localized wage within that regional context. So that's one of the reasons that we have so many different benchmarks. That said, we do understand that having so many different benchmarks can make things complicated. As we move forward in 2019, we'll be working to pare down the benchmarks within each country to those that are most useful to you. We'll be working to update some benchmarks as needed over time, and we'll be exploring, along with the practitioners working group, some ways to find proxy benchmarks in regions where we might not yet have very strong, rigorous regional benchmarks. So that's all part of our work plan, and we'll certainly keep you updated moving forward as we further develop all of these benchmarks. Finally, I wanted to give you a bit of an exciting view into our next steps in 2019. As you all know, the tool that we have is very static. It's in Excel. The benefit of this is that it's easy to use and easy to distribute. But we also want to make sure that we have a centralized and secure place where you can upload your data sheets and get a more interactive view of the data that you've collected. So in 2019, we'll be developing an online dashboard where you'll be able to upload your sheets and then log in and get some different visualizations and some more complex visualizations that will allow you to compare facilities to each other. In addition, what that will do over time is allow us to get a larger data set where we'll be able to get anonymized information about prevailing wage in any given region. And the way that we do that is by gathering lots of data from lots of affiliates so that then you can have a sense of what prevailing wage or average wage is in some of the regions from which you source. So that is part of our next steps for 2019. We'll certainly keep you well updated on those steps, and we look forward to continuing to provide as many tools as we can to help you in this journey towards fair compensation. All right, well, we want to thank you for taking the time to join today's webinar. As always, if you have any questions, either technical about the dashboard, the tool, or the benchmarks, please feel free to reach out to me, Renee Bowers. My email is rBowers@fairlabor.org, or Jose. His email is jperales@fairlabor.org, and we will certainly do everything we can to address your questions. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful night or wonderful day.